Cold linoleum echoed with heavy boots long before the billionaire woke up. Everyone at Chicago General assumed room 412 held just another tragic accident victim. They were completely wrong. When his eyes finally snapped open, he didn't ask for a doctor. He grabbed her throat and demanded his gun. Rain lashed against the ICU windows, smearing the neon lights of Chicago into blurred streaks of red and gold. Claire Evans stood in her light blue scrubs, eyes locked on the steady pulse of the heart monitor. It was 3:15 a.m., the loneliest stretch of her night shift at Chicago General Hospital. She hadn't even seen him move. One heartbeat, he was a silent ghost tethered to a machine, and the next, Claire's breath hitched as his bruised fingers tightened around her windpipe. Not enough to crush, but enough to prove his lethal capability despite 90 days in a seemingly irreversible coma. His name was Vincent Romano, the ruthless architect of the Chicago underworld, a man who commanded vast empires with a mere whisper. He had been brought in with 3 bullets in his chest and a shattered skull, a ghost clinging stubbornly to life. Now, those terrifyingly lucid storm cloud eyes were wide open, pinning her in place. "Where is my weapon?" Vincent rasped, his voice a jagged rumble of broken glass and raw gravel. Claire swallowed hard, forcing her clinical training to override her primal terror. "You are in a hospital," she choked out, her hands gently grasping his thick, tattooed forearm. "You are safe, Vincent. Please, let go. Your stitches will tear." He studied her pale face, the wild animal panic in his gaze slowly giving way to a cold, calculating clarity. He recognized her. He recognized the soft, melodic voice that had read to him during the darkest hours of his unconsciousness. He released her throat, his heavy arm dropping back onto the mattress as a ragged, agonizing cough shook his broad chest. Claire immediately reached for the oxygen mask, but he swatted it away with surprising force. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor accelerated, betraying the immense physical toll his sudden awakening was demanding. She adjusted his intravenous line, murmuring soft words of reassurance, trying to ground the dangerous predator back to reality. For a fleeting moment, the suffocating tension in the room seemed to ease. The silence was broken only by the distant rumble of thunder over the city. Then, Claire heard it. The faint, nearly imperceptible squeak of rubber soles on the hallway linoleum. The 2 massive guards who usually flanked Vincent's door had mysteriously vanished an hour ago, leaving her alone with a creeping sense of dread. The heavy oak door pushed open with a soft click. A man in pale green scrubs stepped into the dim light, a blue surgical mask obscuring the lower half of his face. His identification badge was flipped backward, hiding his name. Claire's pulse hammered violently against her ribs. She took a subtle step, placing herself between the bed and the intruder. "This is a restricted area," she said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with fierce protectiveness. "No orderlies are scheduled for this floor tonight." The man did not speak. His dead, watery eyes were locked entirely on the vulnerable mob boss. He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out a sleek black syringe filled with a thick, clear liquid. It carried no medical label. Claire's training recognized it instantly as potassium chloride. Injected directly into Vincent's central line, it would cause immediate, massive cardiac arrest, flawlessly mirroring a tragic medical complication. "Hey!" Claire shouted, her protective instincts erupting into pure, unadulterated adrenaline. "Get out of here." She lunged toward the red emergency button on the wall, but the fake orderly moved with terrifying speed. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides and backhanded her violently across the face. The sickening crack of the impact echoed in the sterile room. The sheer force sent Claire crashing into the metal tray table, surgical scissors and basins clattering loudly to the floor. Pain exploded behind her eyes, and she tasted copper flooding her mouth. The assassin ignored her fallen body, his singular focus fixed on his prize. He stepped up to the mattress, uncapping the needle with his teeth. He reached for the central port embedded near Vincent's collarbone. "No!" Claire screamed, scrambling forward on her bruised knees. She threw her upper body over Vincent's chest, willing to take the lethal injection herself rather than let her patient die. The orderly snarled, grabbing Claire by her hair and twisting her violently toward the floor. But before he could drive the needle home, a large, pale hand shot out from beneath the tangled white sheets. Long fingers, calloused and wrapped in intricate dark ink, clamped down on the assassin's wrist with the crushing force of an industrial vice. Vincent Romano was severely weakened, but the sheer, monstrous will of the Mafia king fueled his atrophied muscles with pure adrenaline. He twisted the man's arm outward with a sickening snap of breaking bone. The orderly screamed in agony, dropping the lethal syringe onto the blanket. Vincent did not hesitate. He used his grip on the broken wrist to haul his own heavy torso upward, moving with the speed of a striking viper. His other hand bypassed the man's throat, grabbing a thick fistful of his scrubbed top. With a guttural, terrifying roar, the billionaire pulled the assassin down, simultaneously driving his own skull forward in a brutal headbutt. The orderly's nose shattered in a spray of dark crimson. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed heavily onto the linoleum like a puppet with cut strings, entirely unconscious. Silence slammed back into the room, save for the frantic shrieking of the heart monitor alarm. Vincent remained sitting up, his chest heaving violently beneath the thin hospital gown. He turned his head slowly, his cold, gray eyes finding Claire where she knelt trembling on the floor, her cheek swelling and blood trickling from her split lip. She had risked her own life to shield the monster. Vincent reached up with a shaking hand and ripped the remaining medical tape from his skin. The smell of sterile alcohol and raw, primal danger radiated from him. "Turn off that damn machine, Vincent," commanded, his voice a dangerous, low rasp as he surveyed the bleeding assassin. "And get me dressed. We are leaving." "Get me dressed," Vincent had commanded, and the raw authority in his gravelly voice left no room for hesitation. Claire scrambled to her feet, her knees trembling so violently she nearly collapsed again. She moved with frantic efficiency, pulling a pair of oversized surgical scrubs from the nearby supply closet. Her hands shook as she helped him maneuver his heavily tattooed arms into the cotton shirt. He was a furnace of raw heat and suppressed agony, his skin slick with a cold sweat that smelled of sterile alcohol and primal fear. Every movement pulled at the fresh sutures on his chest, but he did not make a single sound of complaint. He leaned heavily against her shoulder, his massive frame completely dwarfing her small stature. "We have to use the service elevator," Claire whispered, her voice surprisingly hollow as she supported his weight. "It requires my biometric scan. Security let that assassin in, which means the main exits are compromised." Vincent studied her face, his piercing gray eyes taking in the swelling bruise on her cheek where the orderly had struck her. "You are bleeding for me, little bird," he murmured, the dark timbre of his voice sending a bizarre shiver down her spine. "I will not forget this." They stumbled out of the shattered hospital room and into the eerily deserted corridor. The usual sterile hum of the West Wing was replaced by a suffocating silence that made the hair on the back of Claire's neck stand up. The two guards who were supposed to protect him were gone, their absence a screaming alarm of betrayal. She slipped her arm securely around his waist, feeling the rigid, atrophied muscles of his abdomen beneath the scrubs. They engaged in a painfully slow, three-legged race down the linoleum hallway, the erratic thud of his heavy boots echoing like a countdown in the empty space. Every shadow felt like a waiting predator, every flickering fluorescent light a warning. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs as they reached the heavy metal doors of the service elevator at the end of the ward. She pressed her thumb to the glowing red scanner. An agonizing second passed before the light flashed green and the doors slid open with a metallic groan. They stepped inside the small metal box, and Vincent immediately slumped against the back wall, his eyes slipping shut as a shallow, ragged gasp escaped his pale lips. "Why did you do it?" he asked suddenly, his voice echoing in the confined space. "You could have let him push that plunger." Claire's breath hitched. She looked at the floor, avoiding his intense, predatory stare. I am a nurse, she replied stubbornly, her fingers clutching the fabric of her own blood-stained scrubs. I save lives. I do not care whose they are. Vincent opened his eyes, pinning her with a gaze that felt entirely too intimate for a man who had just woken from a 3-month coma. You read to me, he countered softly. You held my hand when the fevers spiked. I heard you tell me to keep fighting. The elevator dinged, opening into the cavernous, dimly lit expanse of the basement level. Massive industrial washing machines churned in the distance, masking the sound of their ragged breathing. Claire guided him through the maze of laundry carts, the damp, musty smell of the basement wrapping around them like a wet blanket. As they approached the heavy double doors of the loading dock, 2 massive figures stepped out from the shadows. Claire gasped, freezing in her tracks and instinctively pulling Vincent tighter against her side. Boss, the taller figure said, his voice thick with a rough Chicago accent. He held a suppressed submachine gun at his side. You look like hell. It is good to see you, Marcus, Vincent muttered, his iron grip on Claire's shoulder tightening possessively. Is the perimeter secure? Marcus nodded, his dark eyes shifting suspiciously to Claire. Armored SUV is idling in the alleyway. Who is the collateral? Vincent's posture immediately straightened. His fading physical strength backed by an immovable, terrifying will. She is the only reason I am breathing, the Mafia king stated, brokering absolutely no argument. She comes with us. What? Claire protested, panic clawing up her throat as she tried to pull away from his grip. No, I got you here. My job is done. I have to go back upstairs. Vincent turned, grabbing her upper arms with surprising gentleness but absolute firmness. He leaned down, his face mere inches from hers. Listen to me, he ordered, his breath warm against her bruised cheek. You cannot go back up there. You just saw the face of an assassin sent by my enemies. You are a loose end. If I leave you behind, they will bury you under the Chicago River by morning. You are coming with me until I can guarantee your absolute safety. Do you understand? Before she could formulate a response, Marcus pushed open the heavy loading dock doors. The biting cold of the Chicago storm rushed in, carrying the scent of rain-slicked asphalt and exhaust fumes. A massive, jet-black SUV sat idling in the narrow alleyway, its heavy armored doors already swung open. Claire looked back at the dim hospital basement, realizing with a sickening jolt of finality that her quiet, invisible life was effectively over. She had no choice. She let the dangerous men usher her into the back seat, Vincent sliding heavily onto the dark leather beside her. As the heavy doors slammed shut, plunging them into the protected darkness of the vehicle, Claire realized she had just crossed a terrifying line from which she could never, ever return. The heavy armored SUV tore through the slick, rain-washed streets of Chicago, actively avoiding the main highways and weaving through the industrial backroads of the city. Inside the dark leather cabin, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Vincent had slipped into a semi-conscious state, his head resting back against the seat, his sharp aristocratic features contorted in silent agony. His skin had shifted from a pale waxy hue to a terrifying ashen gray. He is burning up, Claire stated, pressing the back of her trembling hand against his forehead. The sudden, violent adrenaline dump that had fueled his awakening in the hospital was rapidly burning out, leaving his traumatized body defenseless. He needs intravenous fluids and broad-spectrum antibiotics right now, or he is going to slip right back into a coma, or worse, succumb to massive hemorrhagic shock. Marcus grunted from the front passenger seat, his dark eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirrors for any headlights tailing them. We have supplies at the house, the large bodyguard replied gruffly. The private doctor was supposed to be on call, but he went dark 2 hours ago. You are going to have to play doctor tonight, sweetheart. They pulled into an abandoned shipping yard, the massive vehicle rumbling over rusted train tracks before slipping inside a colossal corrugated metal warehouse. The heavy steel doors rolled shut behind them, instantly plunging them into a well-lit, surprisingly luxurious safe house built directly into the warehouse interior framework. Marcus and the driver helped carry Vincent inside, laying his heavy, unresponsive frame onto a large leather sofa in the center of the main room. Claire immediately kicked into gear, shedding her paralyzing fear and letting her clinical instincts completely take over. She found the medical supply cache Marcus pointed out, unzipping a military-grade trauma kit that probably cost more than her yearly nursing salary. She worked furiously, slicing open a bag of saline and hanging it from a tall brass floor lamp. Her hands, though stained with dried blood, were miraculously steady as she started a fresh intravenous line in the crook of Vincent's heavily tattooed arm. She pushed a heavy dose of antibiotics and a carefully measured amount of powerful painkillers straight into the port. As she clamped the line and taped down the catheter, she felt the undeniable weight of his gaze. Vincent was watching her every single move. His piercing gray eyes were sharp, cutting through the fever clouding his system, observing her with the calculated intensity of an apex predator assessing its savior. "You have a very steady hand, little bird," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the quiet room. "My name is Claire," she corrected sharply, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around his thick bicep. "And my hands are steady because I am completely terrified. If you die on my watch, I am pretty sure your men will shoot me." A faint, dark amusement colored his tone. "Marcus would not shoot you," Vincent replied, his chest heaving slightly with every labored breath. "He would probably just lock you in the trunk of the car." "That is not funny," Claire snapped, ripping the Velcro of the blood pressure cuff a little harder than necessary. She looked down at him, the harsh overhead lights casting deep shadows over the hollows of his cheeks. He was a brutal, violently dangerous man who orchestrated chaos for a living, yet looking at him now, stripped of his empire and completely dependent on her care, she felt that same bizarre, unspoken pull of protectiveness she had felt during those lonely nights in room 412. "I remember the smell of vanilla," Vincent said softly, his words coming out of nowhere, freezing Claire in her tracks. She always wore a cheap vanilla body lotion, the only thing she could afford that successfully masked the harsh, sterile smell of hospital bleach. "I remember the sound of pages turning," he continued, his gray eyes locking onto hers, effectively stripping away all her professional defenses. "And I remember you telling me to keep fighting every single time I wanted to let go, to just sink into the dark." "I heard you, Claire." The air in the safe house suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Claire swallowed hard, her heart doing a frantic, erratic flutter against her bruised ribs. This was not a ruthless mob boss talking to a hostage. This was a man bearing a sliver of his soul to the woman who had tethered him to the living world. She pressed her fingers against his pulse point, feeling the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart beneath his warm skin, realizing with terrifying clarity that she was no longer just treating a patient, but falling into a dangerous gravity she could not escape. Before Claire could pull her hand away from Vincent's pulse point, the heavy steel door of the warehouse safehouse clanged loudly, the electronic deadbolt sliding back with a heavy thud that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Marcus drew his suppressed weapon instantly, aiming it squarely at the entrance. Claire scrambled backward, putting the leather sofa between herself and the door. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a soaking wet, bespoke charcoal suit stepped into the room. He ran a hand through his dripping blonde hair, his handsome face twisted into a convincing mask of relief. It was Silas Vance, Vincent's second in command, the man who had been directly responsible for the guards outside room 412. "Thank God, Vincent," Silas breathed, rushing forward and entirely ignoring the weapon Marcus still had leveled at his chest. "When I got the call that the hospital room was empty, I thought the rival families took you. I thought you were dead." Vincent struggled to sit up, groaning low in his throat as his freshly stitched muscles protested the movement. "Who pulled my guards, Silas?" Vincent asked, his voice frighteningly calm. Silas stopped at the edge of the sofa, his dark eyes darting to Claire for a fraction of a second before returning to his boss. "I did," Silas answered smoothly. "We got a tip that the Rossi family was moving on the South Docks tonight. I needed every gun we had. I thought you were safe. Nobody knew you were in room 412 except the inner circle. Exactly, Vincent said softly. The temperature in the safe house seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Nobody knew except the inner circle. Yet an orderly with a syringe of potassium chloride walked right through the front door 10 minutes after you pulled my security detail. Silas let his expression morph into absolute, offended shock. Are you accusing me, brother? I have bled for this family. I took a bullet for your father. You did, Vincent agreed, the dark timbre of his voice completely devoid of emotion. Which is why it breaks my heart, Silas. You got greedy. You wanted the shipping routes for yourself. You are paranoid, Silas scoffed, taking a deliberate step back. The coma scrambled your brains. Did it? Vincent reached beneath the thermal blanket Claire had draped over him, his heavily tattooed hand emerging with a heavy black handgun he must have quietly pulled from Marcus during the chaotic car ride. He aimed the weapon directly at the chest of his second-in-command. When I was in the dark, Silas, I could not move. I could not open my eyes, but my hearing was perfect. Silas froze, the color rapidly draining from his aristocratic face. I heard the doctors talking, Vincent continued, his pale finger slipping over the trigger guard. And I heard you, Silas. I heard you standing next to my hospital bed 2 weeks ago, whispering to someone on the phone. You said to give it another month, and if I did not die on my own, you would help me along because you already had the support of the board. Claire gasped, pressing her trembling hands tightly over her mouth. The profound betrayal hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The mask of loyalty on Silas' face finally shattered. His eyes hardened into cold, calculating slits. He looked at the heavy weapon in Vincent's trembling grip, then at the pale, sweating face of his boss. You can barely hold that weapon, Vincent, Silas sneered, his right hand slowly drifting toward the inside of his tailored suit jacket. You are a ghost. Your time is over. The Chicago Syndicate needs a king, not a corpse. I may be a ghost, Vincent whispered, his grip tightening on the handle, but I still know how to haunt. Silas lunged for the weapon holstered beneath his jacket, calculating that the weakened state of the mob boss would grant him the crucial millisecond needed to strike first. He was fundamentally wrong. Vincent might have possessed the physical strength of a ghost, but his muscle memory was forged in the fires of a brutal, unforgiving underworld. He did not hesitate. The heavy handgun kicked violently in his trembling grip. The deafening roar of the gunshot echoed off the corrugated metal walls of the safe house, a sharp, violent punctuation mark to a decade of misplaced trust. Silas staggered backward, a blossom of dark crimson spreading rapidly across the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt, right below his collarbone. He looked down at the fatal wound in absolute disbelief, his eyes wide. You, Silas choked out, dropping his half-drawn weapon onto the concrete floor. His knees buckled, sending him crashing onto the cold ground with a heavy thud. Marcus was instantly moving, his own weapon leveled at the fallen traitor. Do not twitch, Silas, or I swear to God I will put the next bullet right between your eyes, the bodyguard growled. Claire scrambled over the back of the leather sofa, her hands covering her ears, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had spent her entire career trying to stop people from bleeding, fighting the fragile line between life and death. Now, she was trapped in a room where death was being dealt on purpose, orchestrated by the very man she had just saved. Vincent lowered the gun, his arm dropping heavily to his side as if the weapon weighed 1,000 pounds. The burst of adrenaline that had fueled his awakening was rapidly burning out, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing exhaustion. It does not matter, Silas coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made the medical instincts in Claire flare despite her profound terror. Blood trickled from the corner of the traitor's mouth. He looked up at Vincent with a feral, blood-stained grin. You think I came here alone? You think I did not track the SUV? The Rossi family is not at the South Docks, Vincent. They are outside right now. As if on cue, a massive explosion rocked the foundation of the warehouse. The heavy steel doors groaned in violent protest, and the overhead fluorescent lights flickered before dying completely, plunging the safe house into the eerie crimson glow of emergency backup lighting. Breach! Marcus roared, his voice nearly drowned out by the deafening shriek of tearing metal as another massive explosion rattled the very foundation of the warehouse. Heavy automatic gunfire began to rain against the exterior walls, a terrifying hailstorm of lead and malice echoing through the vast space. Vincent let out a shallow, agonizing gasp as his eyes rolled back into his head. The heavy black handgun slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor as he collapsed backward onto the leather sofa. The portable heart monitor Claire had hooked up began to shriek its frantic warning once again, the red warning light flashing in time with the blaring siren. His blood pressure was plummeting rapidly. His severely weakened body was entering profound hemorrhagic shock. From the sheer stress of the violent exertion and his previously catastrophic injuries. Vincent! Claire screamed, diving over the armrest of the sofa without a single second of hesitation or thought for her own safety. She pressed her trembling fingers to his carotid artery, her heart sinking as she felt his pulse fluttering like a fragile, dying bird beneath his cold, clammy skin. The surgical sutures holding his chest wound together were weeping fresh, bright red blood, the violent trauma of the gun recoil completely tearing at his delicate, healing flesh. "Marcus, he is coding," she yelled over the relentless roar of gunfire outside. "Fix him." The massive bodyguard shouted back, blind firing his assault rifle through a specialized gun port embedded in the heavy steel door. "I am holding them off, but we need to move to the underground extraction tunnel immediately." Claire ripped open the emergency medical kit with frantic, blood-stained hands. She did not have a fully stocked hospital crash cart. She did not have a sterile operating room or a team of highly trained surgeons. She only had her bare hands, a few glass syringes of epinephrine, and her sheer, unadulterated desperation. She drew up a heavy dose of the cardiac stimulant, her hands miraculously steady amidst the absolute chaos and violence unfolding around her. "Do not you dare die on me after everything we just went through," she commanded fiercely, plunging the needle directly into his intravenous port and pushing the plunger down hard. "Do you hear me, Vincent? Keep fighting." She climbed onto the leather sofa, straddling his narrow hips, and placed the heel of her hands precisely over his sternum. She began deep chest compressions, the physical exertion violently tearing at her own bruised ribs from the brutal attack by the fake orderly earlier that night. 1, 2, 3, 4. She pushed with every ounce of physical strength she possessed, her tears mingling with the cold sweat on his pale chest. With every compression, vivid memories of the past 3 months flashed through her racing mind. The quiet, lonely nights in room 412, the soothing smell of rain against the hospital windowpane, the way his strong, heavily tattooed fingers felt completely cold and lifeless in her grasp. She had poured her entire soul into keeping this dangerous man tethered to the earth, and she absolutely refused to let a greedy traitor and a rival mob family sever that cord now. "Breathe, damn it!" she screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unbridled emotion. A secondary explosion suddenly rattled the eastern wall of the safe house. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, coating her hair and scrubs in a thick layer of gray powder. Marcus cursed loudly, slamming a fresh magazine into his smoking weapon. "Claire, we have exactly 2 minutes before they blow the main hinges completely off. We have to move right now." Suddenly, the broad chest beneath her hands arched violently. Vincent dragged in a massive, ragged breath, his gray irises snapping open and blowing wide with shock and intense physical agony. He coughed violently, grabbing her wrists with a crushing grip to immediately stop the compressions. "I am here," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the relentless cacophony of gunfire. "I am here. Tunnel." Now, Claire choked out, hot tears of overwhelming relief tracking through the plaster dust on her swollen cheeks. She scrambled off him, helping him sit up as Marcus abandoned his post at the door, sprinting over to haul the heavy Mafia boss to his feet. Together, they dragged Vincent toward the back corner of the safe house. Marcus kicked away a thick oriental rug, revealing a heavy steel grate set seamlessly into the concrete floor. He hauled it open with a loud grunt, exposing a dark, narrow staircase descending deep into the earth. "Down, both of you," Marcus ordered sharply. "I will rig the explosives on the door. It will buy us a head start." Claire practically carried Vincent down the steep stairs, the damp, musty smell of the underground transit tunnels wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. They stumbled blindly in the oppressive darkness until Marcus caught up a few moments later, the bright beam of his heavy tactical flashlight cutting through the thick gloom. High above them, a muffled, earth-shattering boom signaled the massive detonation of the safe house, burying Silas Vance and any Rossi soldier foolish enough to step inside under tons of burning concrete and twisted steel. The air in the subterranean transit tunnel was thick with the suffocating taste of pulverized concrete and ancient dust. Claire stumbled over the uneven, rotting wooden ties of the forgotten subway tracks, her shoulder burning under the immense, dead weight of Vincent Romano. The deafening echo of the detonated safe house still rang in her ears, a phantom vibration that resonated deep within her bruised ribs. Marcus moved a dozen paces ahead, the harsh beam of his tactical flashlight slicing through the oppressive darkness, his suppressed rifle constantly sweeping the shadows for any Rossi soldiers who might have anticipated this escape route. "Keep moving, little bird," Vincent rasped, his breath hot and ragged against her neck. The sheer effort of placing one heavy boot in front of the other was tearing at the fresh sutures on his chest, but the Mafia king possessed a terrifying reservoir of willpower that defied every medical logic Claire had ever been taught. "We are almost there," Marcus called back softly, the thick Chicago accent barely carrying over the distant, metallic groan of the city infrastructure above them. They walked for what felt like hours, navigating a labyrinth of forgotten prohibition tunnels and decommissioned maintenance shafts, descending deeper into the hidden, concrete veins of the city. Finally, Marcus halted before a massive, rusted steel door that looked as though it had not been opened in 50 years. He bypassed the rusted padlock, punching a 6-digit code into a hidden, biometric keypad concealed behind a loose brick. The heavy door groaned open, revealing a surprisingly pristine, high-tech bunker illuminated by the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. It was an old bootlegging vault, retrofitted with reinforced concrete walls, a bank of encrypted communication servers, and an armory that rivaled a military outpost. "Bring him to the cot," Marcus instructed, immediately moving toward the server bank and pulling a secure satellite phone from a locked drawer. Claire guided Vincent to a simple, military-grade canvas cot in a corner of the room, gently easing his massive frame onto the mattress. His skin was the color of dirty snow, and a fresh bloom of dark crimson was rapidly soaking through the oversized surgical scrub she had put on him back at the hospital. "You are bleeding again," Claire whispered, her voice cracking with sheer exhaustion as she reached for a fresh roll of gauze from her remaining supplies. "The epinephrine is wearing off, Vincent. You need rest. You need a real doctor." Vincent caught her trembling wrist, his grip surprisingly firm, the intricate raven tattoo on his forearm flexing with the effort. "I have you," he murmured, his piercing gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. "I do not need anyone else." He released her wrist and looked across the room at his heavily armed bodyguard. "Make the calls, Marcus," Vincent commanded, the gravelly authority returning to his voice, transforming him from a vulnerable patient back into the undisputed ruler of the Chicago underworld. "Activate the ghost protocol. Reach out only to the inner circle capos who were not copied on Silas security detail changes. We gather the loyalists tonight." Marcus nodded grimly, dialing the first number. Claire worked in silence, using her bare hands and shoe determination to apply heavy pressure to Vincent's weeping chest wound, her vanilla-scented lotion entirely overpowered by the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder. She watched as half a dozen hardened, dangerous men began to filter into the bunker over the next 2 hours, each one looking like a phantom summoned from the shadows of the city. They were the true loyalists, men who wore their scars like badges of honor, and they all froze the moment they saw their boss sitting upright on the cot, alive and breathing. They had believed him dead, a casualty of the warehouse collapse 3 months ago, but the ghost had returned to claim his throne. Vincent did not offer them warm greetings or explanations. He simply leaned forward, his bare, heavily muscled chest rising and falling with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. "Silas is dead," Vincent announced to the silent room, his voice a low, lethal rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "The Rossi family thinks they have won the war. By sunrise, we are going to burn their entire empire to the ground." Claire sat quietly on a metal folding chair beside the cot, her blood-stained hands resting in her lap as she watched the men immediately bow their heads in unquestioning loyalty. She was completely trapped in a subterranean fortress surrounded by the most dangerous men in Chicago, yet as Vincent subtly shifted his weight to ensure he remained positioned between her and the rest of the room, she realized she was not a hostage. She was his protected secret. The quiet, invisible nurse had become the anchor holding the monster to the living world, and as Vincent began to ruthlessly plot the destruction of his enemies, Claire understood that the war had only just begun. The transition from the subterranean bunker to the sprawling penthouse high above the Chicago skyline felt like stepping onto an alien planet. Claire Evans stood barefoot on the heated marble floor, the plush white silk robe swallowing her small frame, a jarring contrast to the blood-stained medical scrub she had worn for the past 48 hours. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city she had always lived in but never truly seen from this dizzying, untouchable height. Down there, the morning traffic was a silent river of lights, completely oblivious to the brutal underworld war that had been ignited overnight. Up here, 40 floors above the chaotic streets, the air was thick with the scent of rich espresso, expensive leather, and the suffocating reality of her new existence. She was effectively a prisoner, albeit one housed in a fortress of unimaginable luxury. For massive men in tailored suits stood guard at the private elevator doors, their presence a constant, terrifying reminder that her quiet, invisible life was officially dead and buried. Her tiny apartment in the South Side, her double shifts at Chicago General, her meager savings, all of it had been meticulously erased by Vincent Romano and his loyalists while she slept a restless, nightmare-filled sleep in the guest wing. She began to pace the length of the massive living room, the soft pad of her bare feet entirely swallowed by the thick Persian rugs. Panic, cold and sharp, continuously clawed at the edges of her mind. She had saved a patient, just as she had sworn to do when she took her medical oath, but in doing so, she had bound herself to a monster. The heavy oak doors of the master study swung open, and the monster himself walked into the room. Vincent moved with a slow, deliberate stiffness that betrayed the lingering agony of his freshly re-stitched chest wound, yet his sheer, terrifying presence instantly shrank the massive penthouse. He had shed the surgical scrubs for a dark pair of tailored trousers and a black dress shirt left unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the angry, jagged scar near his collarbone and the sprawling raven tattoo that crawled up his neck. He paused, his piercing gray eyes locking onto her pacing form. "You are wearing a path into the rug, little bird," Vincent murmured, his voice a low, gravelly caress that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Claire stopped, wrapping her arms tightly around her waist as a protective shield. "I am trapped," she stated, her voice trembling despite her desperate attempt to sound brave. "I do not belong here, Vincent. I need to go home. I need to go back to work." Vincent closed the distance between them with surprising, terrifying grace, stopping just inches away from her. The heat radiating from his massive frame was intoxicating, a primal mix of bergamot and raw, unchecked danger. "You have no home to return to," he said softly, the harsh truth delivered without a single ounce of cruelty. "The Rossi family sent hitmen to your apartment 3 hours ago. They burned it to the ground, Claire. If you had been there, you would be dead." The breath rushed out of her lungs as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes widened, hot tears of shock and grief immediately springing to her lashes. Everything she owned, every photograph of her late mother, every meager possession she had scraped together, was gone. She swayed slightly, the adrenaline suddenly abandoning her, but Vincent caught her instantly. His large, calloused hands gripped her upper arms, steadying her with a strength that was entirely absolute. "I am sorry," he whispered, the ruthless Mafia boss sounding genuinely apologetic for the collateral damage his dark world had inflicted upon her light. "But you are safe here. No one gets off this floor without my explicit permission. You are protected by the full might of the Chicago Syndicate." Protected or imprisoned? Claire choked out, a single tear spilling over her bruised cheek. Vincent reached up, his thumb gently wiping away the tear with a shocking, reverent tenderness. "Both," he admitted, his gray eyes darkening with a possessive intensity that made her heart hammer violently against her ribs. "You stepped into the shadows to save my life, Claire. Now, the shadows are the only place I can keep you safe. You are the only weakness my enemies can exploit, and I will burn this entire city to the foundation before I let them touch a single hair on your head." He pulled her gently against his solid chest, tucking her head beneath his chin. She knew she should fight him, she knew she should push the dangerous predator away, but the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of her shattered life finally broke her. Claire closed her eyes, burying her face in the warm, dark fabric of his shirt, realizing with terrifying clarity that the gilded cage he had built for her was the only thing standing between her and absolute ruin. The sprawling penthouse was silent for exactly 12 hours before the wolves arrived. Claire sat completely still in a high-backed leather wingchair tucked into the shadowed corner of Vincent's massive private office, her knees pulled tightly to her chest beneath the oversized silk robe. She felt like a ghost haunting a world built on blood and expensive bourbon. 5 men walked through the heavy double oak doors, each one radiating the kind of unchecked arrogance that only came from decades of dealing death. These were the capos, the remaining lieutenants of the Chicago Syndicate, and they had come to inspect the king they thought was buried. Vincent sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk, fully dressed in a tailored black suit that perfectly concealed the thick bandages and weeping sutures binding his shattered chest together. His skin was the color of old parchment, and the dark circles beneath his piercing gray eyes betrayed the profound physical agony he was enduring just to remain upright. Vincent, the oldest capo, a thick-set man named Lorenzo, said without bowing his head or showing an ounce of respect. "We got the call from Marcus. Silas is dead, the warehouse is ash, and the Rossi family is mobilizing. But looking at you right now, I have to ask if we are backing a corpse." The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Claire held her breath, her medical instincts screaming that Vincent was pushing his traumatized body far past the point of catastrophic failure. His heart rate was likely erratic, his blood pressure hovering dangerously low, yet he did not even flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, his long, heavily tattooed fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You are asking if I am too weak to lead, Lorenzo," Vincent murmured, his gravelly voice echoing with a terrifying, absolute calm. "You look like you belong in an intensive care unit, boss," another capo sneered, shifting his weight aggressively as he looked around the luxurious room. 3 months in a coma. Your muscles are gone. The streets are whispering that you are a total liability. Silas might have been a traitor, but at least he had the physical strength to hold the territory. The tension snapped like a dry twig. Vincent moved with the terrifying, unholy speed of a striking viper, defying every anatomical law Claire had ever studied. He stood up, his heavy boot kicking the solid mahogany desk so violently it slammed backward into the capos, pinning Lorenzo against the heavy bookshelves. Before the others could even reach for the weapons concealed beneath their suit jackets, Marcus and 3 heavily armed guards stepped from the shadows, raising suppressed automatic rifles. But Vincent waved them down with a single, sharp motion of his hand. He walked slowly around the desk, his presence filling the vast room until it felt suffocatingly small. He stopped inches from the sneering capo, his towering height and broad shoulders completely dwarfing the man. "I was in the dark for 90 days, Vincent whispered, his storm-cloud eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "And while I slept, you grew fat and lazy on my money. You let Silas sell our ports to the Rossi family. Vincent reached out, his calloused hand wrapping violently around the throat of the capo. He lifted the grown man entirely off the floor with one arm. The capo choked, his face turning a brilliant shade of purple as his expensive leather shoes kicked frantically at the empty air. Claire pressed her trembling hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. She could clearly see the dark, wet stain of fresh blood slowly blooming through the pristine white fabric of Vincent's dress shirt as his chest stitches violently tore open under the immense physical strain. He was literally bleeding out to prove a point, sacrificing his own fragile flesh to maintain absolute control of his empire. I am the ghost that came back from hell, Vincent roared, slamming the suffocating man back down onto the hardwood floor. With a bone-rattling crack. And anyone who questions my strength again will be sent down there to take my place. Do you understand? The remaining capos, including the bruised and gasping Lorenzo, fell to their knees instantly, their arrogant rebellion entirely crushed under the sheer, monstrous will of their leader. We understand, boss, they chanted in unison, their voices trembling with absolute terror. Get out, Vincent commanded, his voice dropping back to a lethal, gravelly rasp. Rally the street soldiers. We strike the Rossi family at midnight. The capos scrambled out of the office like frightened animals, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind them. The very second the heavy lock clicked, the terrifying illusion of absolute invincibility vanished. Vincent let out a wet, agonizing groan, his knees instantly buckling beneath him. Vincent! Claire cried out, abandoning her protective corner and sprinting across the Persian rug. She caught his heavy frame just as he collapsed, the warm, metallic scent of fresh blood entirely overpowering the bergamot and expensive leather. He was a terrifying monster to the outside world, a ruthless king who ruled through violence and fear, but as she lowered his heavy head onto her lap and frantically pressed her healing hands against his bleeding chest, she realized she was the only person on earth who truly knew how fragile the king actually was. Marcus and two heavily armed guards rushed into the private office the moment they heard the heavy thud of their boss hitting the hardwood floor, but Claire was already there, her blood-stained hands pressing desperately against the ruined fabric of his white dress shirt. Get into the master bedroom, she commanded, her clinical authority entirely overriding her trembling voice. Together, they hauled Vincent's massive, dead weight down the long corridor and gently deposited him onto the center of the sprawling king-sized mattress. Marcus stepped back, his dark eyes shadowed with genuine fear for the man who ruled Chicago. I will secure the perimeter, the bodyguard murmured before slipping out and pulling the heavy oak doors shut, leaving Claire entirely alone with the fallen king. She worked with frantic, practiced efficiency, using a pair of heavy trauma shears from the medical kit to cut away the ruined silk shirt, exposing the catastrophic damage he had willingly inflicted upon his own healing flesh. The surgical sutures binding the jagged scar across his left collarbone had violently torn open, weeping thick, dark crimson across his pale skin. He was burning with a fresh, aggressive fever, his massive chest heaving with shallow, ragged gasps that sounded like tearing paper in the deafening silence of the luxurious penthouse. You are an absolute idiot, Claire whispered, hot tears of frustration and overwhelming fear blurring her vision as she soaked a sterile sponge in harsh antiseptic. You tore open 3 layers of tissue just to prove a point to men who are not worth a single drop of your blood. Vincent did not argue. His storm cloud gray eyes fluttered open, glassy with profound physical agony, yet they immediately locked onto her face, anchoring his slipping consciousness to her presence. He reached up with a heavy, trembling hand, his calloused fingers clumsily wrapping around her slender wrist to stop her frantic scrubbing. They are worth the city, Vincent rasped, his gravelly voice barely more than a jagged whisper in the dim lighting. And the city is what I need to keep you safe. The air in the room suddenly felt impossibly thick, effectively choking the breath right out of her lungs. Claire swallowed hard, gently but firmly prying his fingers away from her wrist so she could thread a fresh surgical needle. Hold perfectly still, she ordered softly, her heart doing a frantic, erratic flutter against her bruised ribs as she began the excruciating process of restitching his torn flesh without the mercy of local anesthesia. Every time the sharp needle pierced his skin, the massive muscles of his chest flinched, but Vincent never made a single sound of complaint. He simply watched her, his piercing gaze stripping away every single layer of her professional defense, studying her with a raw, unprotected vulnerability that he hid from the entire world. She was close enough to feel the intense heat radiating from his feverish body, close enough to inhale the intoxicating scent of bergamot, dark espresso, and the metallic tang of his blood mingling with her own cheap vanilla lotion. The sprawling tattoo of the raven clutching. A broken crown flexed with his shallow breathing, a stark reminder of the violent syndicate he commanded. "Why did you stay, little bird?" Vincent asked suddenly, his voice low and vibrating against the palm of her hand as she tied off the final, bloody knot. "You could have run when the warehouse detonated. You could have slipped away in the tunnels while Marcus was distracted." Claire froze, her hands hovering above his heavily tattooed chest. She looked down into his eyes, seeing the ghost of the lonely, comatose patient she had read military strategy to in the dead of the night, the man whose hand she had held while the storm raged outside the hospital window. "I told you before," she replied stubbornly, reaching for a roll of pristine white gauze to tightly bandage the fresh wound. "I am a nurse. I do not abandon my patients." "You are a terrible liar," Vincent murmured, a faint, dark amusement coloring his exhausted tone. He reached up again, this time his large hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the swelling purple bruise left by the assassin. The contrast between his lethal, violent nature and the shocking reverence of his touch shattered the final wall protecting her guarded heart. He was a monster to Chicago, a ruthless predator who orchestrated death and chaos from a gilded cage, yet he was looking at her as if she were the only piece of salvation he had ever truly known. "You stayed because you heard me," he whispered, pulling her gently downward until her face hovered mere inches from his own. "You stayed because in the dark, we recognized each other." Claire closed her eyes, a single, betraying tear slipping down her cheek to land on his calloused thumb. She could not deny it anymore. The profound, invisible tether that had formed in room 412 had completely hardened into an unbreakable chain, binding the invisible healer to the beautiful monster. She leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against his, completely surrendering to the terrifying reality that she was falling deeply and irrevocably in love with the most dangerous man in the city. The delicate piece of the penthouse shattered exactly 48 hours later, completely obliterated by the wailing siren of the secure perimeter alarm. Claire bolted upright in the massive bed, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as the blood-red emergency lights bathed the luxurious room in a terrifying, violent glow. Vincent was already on his feet, moving with a lethal grace that entirely ignored the freshly stitched wounds binding his chest. He strapped a heavy tactical vest over his black shirt, his face an impenetrable mask of cold, calculated fury. "The Rossi family is making their final play," Vincent said, his voice a gravelly rumble that barely carried over the shrieking alarm. "They are hitting the South Docks with 24 heavily armed men, and they just sent a strike team into the lobby of this building to deliver their ultimatum." He racked the slide of his assault rifle, the metallic clack echoing like a death sentence in the silent bedroom. "Marcus is securing the elevators, but they will try to breach the stairwell. You stay exactly here, Claire. Do not move unless I tell you to." The sheer volume of automatic gunfire that suddenly erupted from the floor below was deafening, vibrating through the heated marble floorboards and rattling the massive glass windows. Claire pressed her hands over her ears, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she scrambled off the mattress and huddled in the darkest corner of the room, her eyes locked on the heavy oak doors. She was a nurse trained to preserve life, but she was trapped in a glass castle where death was currently the only currency. The radio clip to Vincent's shoulder crackled with frantic, static-filled voices reporting massive casualties at the shipping containers, a coordinated siege designed to completely cripple the Romano syndicate in a single night. Vincent barked tactical commands into the microphone with chilling precision, orchestrating a brutal counteroffensive while simultaneously defending their immediate physical sanctuary. He was a general commanding a blood-soaked chessboard, completely devoid of mercy or hesitation. A sudden, violent explosion shook the entire skyscraper, sending a shower of plaster dust raining down onto the Persian rugs. The reinforced oak doors of the master suite groaned under the immense pressure, and then the unthinkable happened. The heavy wood splintered inward, and 3 masked Rossi soldiers poured into the room, their suppressed weapons scanning the darkness. Vincent did not even blink. He stepped directly in front of the corner where Claire was hiding, effectively turning his massive, battered body into a human shield. His rifle barked with terrifying speed and accuracy. The deafening roar of the close-quarters gunfire left a ringing silence in its wake as the 3 attackers collapsed lifelessly onto the imported carpet. The smell of raw gunpowder and copper instantly flooded the room, choking the breath right out of Claire's lungs. Her cheap vanilla lotion was entirely overpowered by the stench of burning cordite. "Clear the hallway." Vincent roared into his radio, his storm cloud eyes scanning the destroyed doorway for any remaining threats. He dropped the empty magazine and seamlessly slammed a fresh one into the weapon, his chest heaving with exertion, the fresh white bandages beneath his shirt already blooming with a terrifying shade of crimson. "The docks are secure, boss," Marcus' voice finally crackled through the radio, heavy with exhaustion but laced with grim victory. "The Rossi strike team is entirely neutralized. We held the territory." Vincent lowered his weapon, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system as he turned to look at Claire. She was trembling violently, her knees pulled to her chest, her wide eyes reflecting the carnage scattered across the beautiful bedroom. This was the violent, unapologetic reality of the man she loved. There was no escaping the blood that stained his hands or the constant, lingering threat of death that surrounded his throne. He walked over to her, dropping the heavy rifle onto the mattress before kneeling on the ruined floorboards. His large, warm hands gently framed her pale face, his thumbs smearing a streak of soot across her cheek. "I told you I would burn the city to keep you safe," Vincent whispered, his voice incredibly tender despite the violence he had just committed. "The ultimatum has been answered. The Rossi family is broken." Claire looked past his broad shoulders at the fallen men, then back into his piercing gray eyes. The terrifying truth settled deep into her bones. She reached up, her small, healing hands resting gently over his large, calloused ones. He was a monster, a ruthless predator who dealt in absolute violence. But he was her monster, and as the sirens wailed deep into the Chicago night, she realized she would rather endure 1,000 wars by his side than ever return to the lonely, invisible piece of her past. The morning sun bled over the Chicago skyline, casting long, harsh shadows across the penthouse living room where the blood had finally been scrubbed from the heated marble floorboards. The lingering scent of harsh industrial bleach mingled with the rich aroma of dark espresso, a bitter combination that perfectly mirrored the brutal reality of the new day. Vincent Romano sat at the head of the massive glass dining table, his broad shoulders tense beneath a fresh black dress shirt that artfully concealed the heavy layers of white gauze and weeping stitches wrapped around his shattered chest. He was holding a war council. 4 of his most trusted remaining lieutenants, including Marcus and the freshly bruised Lorenzo, stood around the table, their faces grim as they reviewed the architectural blueprints of the Rossi family shipping warehouses. Claire sat completely silently in a velvet armchair tucked into the shadowed corner of the room, her knees pulled tightly together, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To the Comatose, she was entirely invisible. They looked right past her, dismissing the quiet nurse as nothing more than collateral damage or a temporary, fragile plaything of their ruthless king. But Claire was entirely accustomed to being invisible. She had spent her entire adult life navigating the chaotic, crowded corridors of Chicago General, completely ignored by arrogant surgeons and demanding hospital administrators. That invisibility was her greatest weapon. It allowed her to observe, to watch the microscopic details that arrogant men always failed to hide. As the Comatose loudly debated the tactical logistics of the upcoming midnight raid, Claire let her clinical gaze drift over each man. She watched their breathing patterns, the capillary refill in their hands as they gripped their porcelain coffee cups, the subtle shifts in their aggressive posture. Her eyes locked onto Julian, a charismatic, sharply dressed enforcer who controlled the northern gambling rackets. Julian was speaking with absolute, passionate loyalty, cursing the Rossi family for their cowardly siege on the penthouse the night before. Yet, as Julian spoke, Claire noticed the glaring physiological inconsistencies screaming from his body. The ambient temperature of the penthouse was a cool 68 degrees, yet a thin, distinct sheen of cold sweat coated Julian's upper lip. His pupils were blown wide, entirely swallowing his dark irises, a classic autonomic response to a massive surge of adrenaline. More damning than the sweat or the dilated eyes was the frantic, fluttering pulse visible at his carotid artery, beating a terrified staccato against the stiff white collar of his designer's shirt. Julian was not furious. He was absolutely terrified. "We will slaughter them, boss," Julian proclaimed, leaning his weight against the heavy glass table, though Claire noted the fine, uncontrollable tremor in his fingers. Silas was a greedy fool, but to coordinate with the Rossi family and send a disguised orderly into your hospital room to push poison into your veins, that breaks the ancient laws. We have to make a bloody example of them. The violent words hung in the sterile air. Vincent nodded slowly, his gray eyes scanning the paper blueprints, his exhausted, agonizingly painful mind focused entirely on the tactical strike. But in the shadowed corner, Claire felt the blood turn to absolute ice in her veins. She remembered the frantic, whispered conversations in the subterranean bunker. She remembered every single word Vincent had spoken to the inner circle when he declared Silas a traitor. He had said Silas pulled his security detail. He had said Silas sent an assassin. Vincent had never once mentioned an orderly. He had never mentioned the disguise. Only 3 people in the entire world knew the assassin was wearing light green scrubs, and 2 of them were sitting in this penthouse. The third was the dead man on the hospital floor. Claire stood up. The soft rustle of her silk robe seemed to echo like a gunshot in the tense silence of the war room. 5 dangerous men turned to look at her, a flash of pure annoyance crossing Julian's sweating face. "Vincent," Claire said, her voice soft, melodic, but carrying an iron core of absolute certainty that commanded the immediate attention of the Chicago King. "Yes, little bird," Vincent answered, immediately turning his full, predatory focus toward her, completely ignoring his lieutenants. "When you briefed the men in the bunker, you told them Silas sent an assassin," Claire stated, her gaze locking onto Julian, watching the color rapidly drain from his aristocratic face. "You never told them the man was dressed as an orderly. You never told them he had a syringe." The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Julian's frantic pulse skyrocketed. He took a stumbling step backward, his trembling hand instinctively reaching for the heavy weapon concealed beneath his tailored jacket. He did not even manage to clear the leather holster. Marcus moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned killer, drawing his suppressed handgun and leveling it directly at Julian's forehead. Vincent did not draw a weapon. He simply stood up from the table, his movements slow, deliberate, and radiating a cold, apocalyptic fury. "You were the secondary mole," Vincent whispered, the gravelly rumble of his voice making the heavy glass table vibrate. "Silas coordinated the hospital hit, but you were the one feeding him the shift schedules of my private security detail." "Boss, please, she is lying, she is just a crazy nurse," Julian stammered, his hands raising in the air, his chest heaving as the physical tells of his profound guilt completely consumed him. "She is the woman who tethered my soul to the earth," Vincent roared, closing the distance in 2 massive strides and violently backhanding the traitor across the jaw. Julian collapsed onto the marble floor, spitting a mouthful of blood as Marcus immediately placed a heavy boot on his throat. Vincent turned back to Claire, the violent monster fading just enough to reveal the profound, awestruck reverence in his storm-cloud eyes. She had not just saved his life with bandages and desperate chest compressions. She had used her quiet, invisible brilliance to surgically extract the final poison hiding within his empire. She was not just his healer anymore. She was his equal, his ultimate weapon, and together, they were going to burn the rest of their enemies to ash. The lifeless body of Julian was dragged from the pristine marble floor of the penthouse, leaving behind a stark, smudged trail of dark crimson that signaled the absolute end of mercy in Chicago. Vincent Romano did not pause to mourn the betrayal of his inner circle. He transformed into the terrifying, mythical beast the underworld had always whispered about, a man forged in pure violence and driven by a cold, apocalyptic wrath. The War Council shifted from a defensive strategy to an immediate, brutal purgation. Marcus distributed heavily encrypted radios, while the remaining lieutenants mobilized every single street soldier, enforcer, and loyalist still drawing breath under the Romano banner. Claire watched from the shadows of the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs as the man she loved strapped on a heavy Kevlar vest over his weeping chest wounds, his piercing gray eyes entirely devoid of humanity. "You should be resting, Vincent," Claire whispered, her voice trembling as she approached him, her small hands resting against the cold, tactical armor. "Your stitches are barely holding, and you have lost too much blood." Vincent looked down at her, his calloused, heavily tattooed fingers gently grazing the curve of her jaw. "The bleeding stops tonight, little bird," he murmured, his gravelly voice vibrating with a lethal promise. "I am going to carve the Rossi family out of this city root and stem, so you never have to look over your shoulder again." He kissed her forehead, a fleeting moment of profound warmth in a room chilled by the promise of death, and then he was gone. The heavy oak doors sealed shut, leaving Claire entirely alone with two massive guards and a tactical radio sputtering to life on the glass dining table. For the next 12 hours, Claire did not sleep. She sat huddled in the velvet armchair, wrapped tightly in her silk robe, listening to the horrific symphony of the underworld war broadcasting through the static. She heard the coordinated strikes on the Rossi family illegal casinos in the South Side, the crackle of automatic gunfire echoing through the hidden smuggling ports along Lake Michigan, and the ruthless, systematic elimination of every capo who had dared to align with the traitors. Vincent led the charge himself, refusing to lead from the rear. His gravelly voice commanded the airwaves, cold, precise, and completely devoid of hesitation. He moved like a phantom of vengeance through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. When the Rossi family boss attempted to flee the city in an armored convoy toward the state line, Vincent and Marcus ambushed them beneath the rusted steel supports of an abandoned elevated train track. Through the radio, Claire heard the deafening roar of explosives, the shriek of tearing metal, and the final, pathetic pleas of the men who had orchestrated the hit in her hospital room. She pressed her hands over her mouth, hot tears spilling down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the sheer, devastating scale of the violence being committed in her name. She had spent her entire life trying to heal broken people, and now she was the anchor for a man tearing the world apart. Yet, beneath the terror, a strange, intoxicating warmth bloomed in her chest. For the first time in her lonely, invisible existence, she was entirely protected. No one would ever dismiss her, threaten her, or hurt her again, because the monster ruling the shadows had claimed her as his own. The hours dragged on, each minute marked by frantic radio chatter and the distant sirens wailing across the city grid. Claire paced the length of the marble floor, her bare feet silent, her mind racing with terrifying images of Vincent bleeding out in some dark alleyway. But the ghost of Chicago refused to die. As the first pale light of dawn began to crack over the skyline, painting the heavy storm clouds in vibrant shades of red and gold, the radio finally fell silent. The war was over. The Romano Syndicate had executed a flawless, bloody purgation, reclaiming every inch of lost territory and entirely erasing their rivals from the map. The heavy doors of the penthouse hissed open, and Vincent walked slowly into the room. He was covered in soot, rain, and the blood of his enemies. He looked like a man who had walked through the deepest fires of hell and somehow survived. His assault rifle slipped from his exhausted grip, clattering loudly against the marble floor. Claire did not hesitate. She ran across the room, completely ignoring the grime and violence clinging to him, and threw her arms around his waist. Vincent let out a ragged, agonizing sigh, his massive arms wrapping tightly around her small frame, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He smelled of burning cordite, raw adrenaline, and a coppery tang of fresh blood, but beneath it all, he was still the vulnerable man who had listened to her read in the dark. The king had defended his throne, the traitors were buried, and the city was completely his, but as he held Claire trembling against his chest, the only victory that truly mattered was the fact that he had returned home to her. The adrenaline that had sustained Vincent Romano through the brutal purgation of the Chicago underworld finally evaporated the moment he collapsed onto the mattress of the master bedroom. The terrifying, mythical ghost of the city was instantly replaced by a profoundly broken man, his massive body pushed far beyond the absolute limits of human physiological endurance. Claire did not allow herself to weep or succumb to the exhaustion dragging at her own bones. She stripped away his blood-soaked tactical armor and ruined clothing, her hands moving with the frantic, practiced efficiency of a seasoned trauma nurse. His fever had returned with a terrifying vengeance, his skin radiating a dry, dangerous heat that made her breath catch in her throat. For 3 agonizing days, the luxurious penthouse transformed back into a sterile intensive care unit. Marcus procured military-grade antibiotics, fresh bags of saline, and heavy painkillers, leaving them quietly at the shattered oak doors while Claire waged a silent, desperate war against the infections threatening to claim the Mafia king. She barely slept, surviving entirely on cold espresso and the sheer, undeniable force of her love for him. She bathed his burning skin with cool water, meticulously re-stitched the wounds that the violent recoil of his assault rifle had torn completely open, and whispered the same ancient military strategies she had read to him in room 412, deliberately anchoring his wandering consciousness to the familiar cadence of her voice. On the 4th morning, the heavy fever finally broke. Vincent opened his piercing gray eyes, the glassy haze of agony entirely replaced by a sharp, lucid clarity. He did not speak, but he reached out with a trembling hand, his heavy, tattooed fingers tangling gently in her hair, silently pulling her down to rest against his uninjured side in a profound surrender. The healing process over the next 3 weeks was slow, agonizing, and incredibly intimate. As Vincent slowly regained his monstrous physical strength, his absolute grip on the city tightened with equal measure. The penthouse became the undisputed throne of the Chicago syndicate. Remaining capos and street bosses arrived daily, bowing their heads respectfully not just to Vincent, but to the quiet, observant woman sitting faithfully by his side. The rival Rossi family was entirely eradicated, their territories absorbed, their assets seized, and their surviving soldiers swearing absolute, terrified allegiance to the Romano name. Claire watched the ruthless consolidation of power with a mixture of awe and lingering dread, intimately understanding the rivers of blood that had been spilled to secure this fragile peace. Yet, whenever the heavy oak doors closed and the dangerous men departed, the untouchable billionaire vanished, leaving only the man who looked at her with a raw, unprotected reverence. They spent long hours sitting in the shadowed study, watching the autumn storms roll over Lake Michigan. He taught her the intricate, brutal politics of his dark world, refusing to hide the violent reality of his empire from her, while she slowly taught him how to accept gentle care without viewing it as a profound weakness. The physical scars on his chest gradually thickened and faded into jagged white lines, a permanent map of the brutal war they had survived together. "You saved my life twice, little bird," Vincent murmured one evening, his calloused thumb tracing the fading bruise on her jaw. "I simply refuse to let the city take you away from me," Claire replied softly, leaning heavily into his warm touch. The internal shifts within Claire were far more profound than any physical wound. She had stepped out of her invisible, lonely existence and into a world governed by violence, absolute loyalty, and unchecked power. The quiet, exhausted nurse who had constantly worried about eviction notices and double shifts was gone forever, replaced by a resilient woman who could stare down hardened killers without flinching. As the crisp autumn winds began to sweep through the city streets 40 floors below, the Chicago underworld finally settled into a quiet, absolute submission. Vincent was fully restored to his terrifying glory, his empire secure, his enemies buried deep within the earth, and his failing health completely stabilized by the hands of the woman he loved. But the war had demanded a heavy emotional toll, stripping away every innocent illusion Claire had ever held about the world. She knew the absolute monster, she deeply loved the vulnerable man, and as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the sprawling city lights flicker to life, she knew the ultimate reckoning of her new existence was rapidly approaching. The deep chill of December finally descended upon Chicago, dusting the sprawling city in a pristine layer of white snow that effectively masked the brutal violence of the Autumn War. Claire Evans stood on the massive glass balcony of the penthouse, wrapped securely in a heavy cashmere coat, watching the frozen surface of Lake Michigan glitter under the pale winter sun. The physical bruises on her skin had long since faded, and the terrifying, chaotic nights in a subterranean bunker felt like a distant nightmare, yet the internal shifts within her soul were entirely permanent. She was no longer the invisible night shift nurse who quietly accepted the scraps of the world. She had stood beside a monster as he burned an empire to the ground, and she had discovered her own terrifying strength in the ashes. Footsteps sounded softly on the heated marble floor behind her. Claire did not turn around. She recognized the steady, confident gait immediately, a sound completely devoid of the agonizing limp that had plagued him for the past month. Vincent Romano stepped onto the frozen balcony, sliding his massive arms around her waist from behind and pulling her flush against his solid chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply, entirely surrounding her with the intoxicating scent of bergamot, dark espresso, and absolute, unrivaled power. The fever was gone, the bandages were removed, and the man holding her was a terrifyingly beautiful, lethal force of nature, entirely restored to his former glory. Marcus just confirmed the final wire transfers. Vincent murmured, his lips brushing against her post point, sending a delicious, familiar shiver down her spine. The Rossi family accounts have been completely drained and redistributed. The syndicates from New York to Las Vegas have formally recognized our undisputed claim over the Chicago territory. The war is officially over, little bird. And there are no more threats. Claire asked softly, leaning her head back against his broad shoulder, finding profound comfort in the solid wall of his chest. None, Vincent replied, his grip tightening slightly, his hands resting protectively over her stomach. My empire is entirely secure, and there is absolutely no one left in the underworld who would ever dare to breathe your name. Claire closed her eyes, absorbing the profound warmth radiating from his massive frame. The transition from a dedicated, solitary hospital nurse to the untouchable companion of a mafia boss had been dizzying, terrifying, and profoundly intoxicating. She had witnessed the darkest, most violent parts of his world, and yet, she had never felt safer or more deeply cherished than she did right now, wrapped securely in his dangerous arms. Vincent gently turned her around, his strong, calloused fingers tilting her chin up so she was forced to look directly into his piercing gray eyes. The cold, calculated predator she had seen awaken in room 412 was entirely replaced by a man looking at the only woman who had ever truly seen his soul. I told you I remembered the sound of your voice and the smell of your vanilla lotion, Vincent said softly, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw with shocking reverence. But I never told you what actually kept me fighting when the darkness tried to pull me under for good. What was it? Claire whispered, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs just as it had on that fateful night in the hospital. I needed to see the face of the angel who refused to let me die, he replied, his voice a gravelly caress that melted the winter chill. I owe you my life, Claire, but more than that, I want to give you the entire world. If you want to leave, I have a private jet currently idling at O'Hare. I have secured a brand new, flawless identity for you, and I have deposited $50 million into an untraceable offshore account. You can walk away right now, and you will never have to look over your shoulder again. He paused, a raw, devastating vulnerability filling his eyes, a stark contrast to his fearsome, ruthless reputation. But if you stay entirely by my side. Not as a nurse, not as a hostage, but as my equal. As my queen. Claire looked at the sprawling, frozen city below them, the vast, shimmering empire that now bowed completely to the man standing before her. She thought about her lonely life before she met him, the endless, exhausting shifts, the quiet desperation of her solitary existence. She looked back at Vincent, feeling the raw, primal connection pulling them together like inevitable magnets. She reached up, her small fingers threading into his dark, thick hair. She did not need to read ancient military strategy to understand the final victory. The war was already won. "I am not going anywhere," Claire whispered, right before pulling his lips down to hers. The kiss was a breathtaking collision of fire and salvation, sealing their fate completely. The invisible nurse had not just saved the dangerous Mafia boss. She had claimed his dark heart entirely, ready to rule the shadows by his side forever. Did this gripping Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the thrilling twists, the intense emotional drama, and the undeniable chemistry between Claire and Vincent, please hit that like button. Welcome to Sunni Romance, where we bring your darkest, most romantic fantasies to life. Do not forget to share this amazing video with your friends who love dark romance, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking stories. Comment down below what you think happens next in their dangerous world, and let us know which trope you want to hear next.